Every week, Asia News Weekly brings you some of the biggest stories from the Asia-Pacific region. You can listen to the podcast through iTunes or Stitcher Radio, but also download every show from our website, asianewsweekly.net, where you'll find a minute-by-minute breakdown of all the stories in this week's episode. Government upheaval in Thailand, a drink called Poo Poo, and South Korea and China are upset with Japan again. I'm Steve Miller. These stories and more are on the May 9th edition of Asia News Weekly. Welcome to the show, everyone. Our first story this week is from China. Events continue to escalate in the South China Sea between Japan and China in the wake of Obama's statement that Senkaku, called Diaoyu in China, falls within the scope of the United States-Japan Mutual Cooperation and Security Treaty. This past week, Japanese fishery patrol vessels fired paintballs at a Taiwanese fishing boat and chased it away from an area near the disputed area. The Chinese boat then returned to Taiwan covered with paint. Reports say that the captain and 5 crew members were unhurt in the incident. Taiwan's Coast Guard administration said it was notified that the fishing boat had gone 8 nautical miles past the limit set by the Taiwanese government southwest of the disputed islands. A Taiwanese Coast Guard vessel went to rescue the fishing boat, which had been fleeing from a Japanese fisheries agency vessel for about an hour. According to the reports, when the Coast Guard administration vessel arrived, several Japanese vessels were involved. The Japanese patrol asserted they had evidence that the fishing boat breached Japan's maritime borders and requested to board the vessel. The Taiwanese Coast Guard officers rejected that request. The Taiwanese Coast Guard escorted the fishing boat back to its territorial waters, and the Japanese vessel pursued. It's a further sign that after what could be called a lull in confrontations in the area, a storm might be approaching. According to Reuters, Japanese military exercises will run between the 10th and 27th of May on, quote, a small uninhabited island in the Ryukyu chain some 600 kilometers northeast of the disputed islands. While Japan has conducted similar exercises in the past, this will be the first time that the Japanese military will use an actual uninhabited island as part of the island defense training exercise. Japan's defense ministry said, quote, boosting island defense is something that has been mentioned in the defense white paper in recent years. No mention was specifically made of China or Taiwan. However, the message was clear. We will be ready, and the U.S. shall stand with us. This comes on the heels of Japan announcing 4 deployed radar installations, stationing 100 troops near China's border, China drilling oil in what Vietnam considers its exclusive economic zone and then ramming vessels, maritime exercises to be conducted by the United States and the Philippines, and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe speaking in Europe stating, quote, in the South China Sea, there has been a series of actions based on unilateral claims, and a sense of urgent vigilance is mounting among regional countries. China has also announced plans to conduct naval exercises jointly with Russia off the coast of Shanghai, and interestingly enough, recently accepted an invitation from the United States to participate in the multinational RIMPAC naval exercises this summer that actually includes many countries it's currently having territorial disputes with. The drills themselves will be innocuous and not contribute to risks of conflict. Those standing on the bridge of these vessels know their roles and won't let things get out of hand. It's most likely a way for nations to try and intimidate one another, show signs of strength, and gain operational military intelligence. It's what will happen next that will be key. After the exercises conclude, we could see China or Taiwan use military vessels to encroach on the disputed islands either by sea or by air, as both have been previously used. How Japan reacts, should that occur, will determine the overall tone in the region. Japanese leadership has repeatedly said it will forcefully defend sovereign Japanese territory. The question remains, to what degree will Japan respond, and if these military exercises will now be a part of the status quo for the region. But what do you think? Do you think these military exercises are a good idea, or just the next step in escalating tensions? Are those participating declaring alliances? Be sure to share your thoughts with me in the comments, on Facebook, or via Twitter. Coming up in just a little bit, the latest from Thailand. China is selling ground-to-ground ballistic missiles to the highest bidders, as evidenced by Saudi Arabia displaying a Chinese Dongfeng 3 intermediate-range ballistic missile during a military parade on April 29th. It's a business relationship that dates back to the 1980s after Israel successfully launched a ballistic missile, and the United States declined to sell weapons to the Saudis. These missiles that were displayed can only fly about 300 kilometers, but are accurate to within 500 meters, making their guidance systems desirable to countries with delivery vehicles that can travel longer distances. Which brings me to North Korea. The DPRK has been testing intercontinental ballistic missile engines that could power a projectile well over 10,000 kilometers. However, it's generally thought that North Korea's guidance control capabilities need a lot of work before the missiles could be considered weaponized for accuracy. In recent weeks, North Korea has repeatedly said its neighbors should prepare for a, quote, new type of nuclear test. Activity around their test facility has stalled somewhat in the past week, but most analysts still predict we could see a fourth nuclear test sometime this year, despite China voicing their objections. This new type of test could take on many meanings. As I mentioned last week, it may be that they're planning 2 tests back-to-back to reduce international condemnation, but others also think they might be planning a missile test as well to show proof of concept they'd be able to place a warhead atop a missile. If that's the case, engineers in North Korea might be able to reverse engineer or adapt a Chinese guidance system purchased directly from Beijing or abroad. If the nuclear test takes place, or pinpoint accuracy ICBM launched, expect tensions to rise in the region. If both events take place, I suspect tensions would rise to their highest levels in years. I also believe the international community would put an enormous pressure on China to define where it stands with the DPRK. Given recent reports of China's support and military exercises with Russia and Iran, North Korea needs to carefully think how it wishes to proceed, as China appears to be filling its dance card with others. This may in fact be the straw that breaks the camel's back and completely isolate Kim from his one-time allies. You can visit AsiaNewsWeekly.net for links to the stories mentioned in this week's podcast. While there, you can leave your thoughts in the comments section. You can also share them via Facebook and Twitter and receive updated information throughout the week. Just go to facebook.com/AsiaNewsWeekly or follow @AsiaNewsWeekly on Twitter. As we look at the world around us today, I think one of the most important things to cherish is a free and independent press. Having individuals who can accurately question and report on events is key to better understanding the world around us. The NHK, the flagship broadcaster in Japan, is often described as the Asian version of the BBC. This past January, some serious questions arose about the NHK's neutrality during the inaugural news conference meeting with NHK President Katsuto Momii. He inferred the network would echo the government's position, saying, quote, "It would not do for us to say left when the government is saying right." There was such outrage and the perceived bending to government will. Momii appeared April 13th to apologize, saying, quote, "I will never attempt to reflect my personal perspective in programs." In a meeting of NHK's Board of Governors, Kenji Iwataki said, quote, "I want Momii to implement what he said in his apology on the TV program and narrow the gap with NHK employees through dialogue." 2 days later, he was out. NHK Governor Naoki Hyakuta, selected by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, angered many when he denied the Nanjing massacre and accused the United States of war crimes. He later clarified that his comments were personal and not related to his NHK position. In December, Hiroshi Miyake of the Japanese Restoration Party thought some NHK documentaries were hostile towards Japan, even going so far as to say that some in the organization were receiving secret directives from China to undermine the nation. Journalists around Japan are adhering to their principles and refusing to bow to political pressure, despite possible ramifications from the state secrets law, which could ultimately prevent them from focusing on sensitive stories. Imagine the world we could be living in if The Guardian didn't publish what Snowden had obtained from the NSA. Quote, "Journalism provides a platform for informed discussion across a wide range of development issues, from environmental challenges and scientific progress to gender equality, youth engagement, and peacebuilding. Only when journalists are at liberty to monitor, investigate, and criticize policies and actions can good governance exist." End quote. That is from a joint statement released by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon and UNESCO Director Irina Bokova speaking regarding 2014's World Press Freedom Day. And I couldn't agree more. It's quite disturbing when we see governments from so-called developed nations interfere with journalists. It's something more akin to what happens in what we commonly refer to as, quote, developing countries. 2 days after World Press Freedom Day, 2 more bloggers, really citizen journalists, have been arrested in Vietnam. Nguyen Hue Vinh and his employee, Nguyen Thi Minh Thuy, were detained for posting articles that allegedly contained, quote, bad content and incorrect information that reduces the prestige and trust in state agencies. They have been charged under Article 258 of the Penal Code, covering, quote, abuse of democratic freedoms. Now, this carries sentences ranging from warnings to 2 years in prison or 7 years in grave circumstances. Reporters Without Borders research chief Lucy Morion wrote, quote, "The arrest of 2 more bloggers just 2 days after World Press Freedom Day is a clear signal by the authorities and shows that Vietnam is going further down the road of repression. Penal Code Article 258 is often used to silence information providers when they start to irritate the authorities too much. We call for the immediate release of Vinh and Thuy and 31 other bloggers who are still detained. It is time the government stop persecuting individuals who use the freedom of expression and information guaranteed by Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights." End quote. Vinh worked for the police for 15 years before creating the Sidewalk news agency. In 2007, Vinh created Basam and wrote under the name An Basam, meaning gossiper. He covered topics including Chinese foreign policy towards Vietnam regarding the disputed Paracel and Spratly Islands, and several times he had to change internet hosts to avoid having a site being blocked. Another site he operated was closed in 2013 without notice. Currently, Vietnam is ranked 174th out of 180 countries in the 2014 Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. It also is on a Reporters Without Borders list of enemies of the internet because of its persecution of bloggers and cyber dissidents. This has been a pretty heavy story, but stay with us till the end of the show to learn about a marketing effort in China gone bad. Both China and South Korea criticized Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe last week for not following Germany's path for reconciliation with enemies following World War II. In an interview with a German newspaper, Abe stated, "In Europe, there was a pan-European quest for the great goal of European integration in addition to Germany's own commitment, so the creation of a community and also reconciliation were promoted." Abe said the situation in Asia was different. Japan has signed a peace treaty with neighbors that settled compensation issues with them, along with making a sincere apology for its wartime past. It's the latter issue that South Korea and China usually take exception with. Both nations feel that Japan has been insincere in acknowledging past wrongdoings, and the words spoken in many apologies are hollow, referring to how revisionists in Japan minimize or obscure historical events and the absence of a formal apology from the emperor. Abe has repeatedly said he is open for dialogue with China and South Korea, but the latter's President Park has set preconditions that Japan essentially adopt Seoul's view of history. There can be no simple resolution to the tensions between these three Asian giants. It's been far too long for Japan to step back in time and apologize in the way that China and South Korea wish it to, especially since the United States didn't force the issue when it administered Japan following the war. But the blame isn't only on Japan. Both China and South Korea continue to live in the past, adhering to the cultural wrongdoing done to them. In essence, they are unable to move forward. Adopting that position, in a matter of speaking, still enables both nations to be subjugated by a Japan of the past, rather than life in the present. George Santayana is credited with saying, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." In East Asia, it's a problem of not being able to forgive the past to ensure a prosperous present. Asia is an incredibly dynamic and diverse place, and if you're really interested in Asia, why don't you follow me on Twitter? Every day, I take pictures and share videos of my life here in Korea and my travels abroad. You can follow me at QiRanger, that's at QI Ranger. This week, I take you through some back alleys, share my travel tips, and ask for your suggestions for special photos you would like to see of Korea. March 11th, 2011 marked what many have called one of the most devastating earthquakes to ever hit Japan. As someone who lives in Asia, I have several friends living throughout Japan, and on that day I was absolutely riveted to coverage, trying to make sure everyone I knew was all right. My heart sank as reports came in, and I saw the pictures and video that displayed the devastation. But in the aftermath, I was also disturbed by the lack of common sense by many and the perpetuation of fear by governments and the media. A few days after the earthquake, there was a thunderstorm forecast here in Seoul, and the Korean government actually started canceling schools under pressure from parents. People were keeping their kids inside, and there were large signs on display saying to use umbrellas to protect yourself against radioactive rain. Of course, all of these never came to pass. Now, there are problems in Fukushima, and they are significant. And I'm not entirely trustful of TEPCO or the Japanese government to release the full data. And I also think they have not done as much as they could have to contain and clean up the issue. However, around the world, there have been calls to ban food products from Japan, based on some very irrational fears. Even today, when I travel to Japan, I still get questions on whether or not it's really safe for me to go there. Of course it's safe, as is the nation's food. After all, there are people living in Japan, locals. They eat the same food that is being shipped abroad. They're not dropping off like flies, so the food that's being exported is going to be safe as well. Critical reporting of events is needed, but so is critical thought when reading or listening to the news. Stop. Listen. Think about the story. Those that report the news can't always be experts in every field. So in a story about banning food from Japan over radiation fears, ask yourself, what does the science say? In stories like these, a balanced and scientific approach is what is needed to better inform and provide accurate information. Tension, confrontation, and protests have been a staple in Thailand for months as opposition leaders have been trying to reshape the nation's government. However, what ultimately may place the ordeal one step closer to conclusion is Thailand's constitutional court, ruling unanimously this past Wednesday that Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra must step down for violating the Constitution in 2011 for reassigning the national security chief. The court said she could no longer serve in the caretaker government. Niwa Tamrong Bunsongpaisan has been tapped to helm the new government. 9 cabinet members involved with the unlawful transfer have also been stripped of their positions. Quote, "The Prime Minister's status has ended. Yingluck can no longer stay in her position acting as caretaker Prime Minister," end quote, said a judge during the live televised ruling. The Prime Minister's supporters say the allegations were politically motivated, and the court has a history of ruling against her. Protesters still occupy several areas in Bangkok, and pro-government red shirts are planning on holding their own rallies in support of Shinawatra. Plans are underway for a July 20th election, but they haven't been formalized or submitted to the king for approval. Protesters blocked several polling locations and created such disruption that the February 2nd election was declared void. This could happen again, as yellow shirt anti-government protesters say they will create havoc once more until necessary political and electoral reforms are in place. Some worry further clashes may take place after this ruling. While the violence and disruption has played out on television and throughout other mediums, those I've spoken to in Thailand say this kind of upheaval seems to take place every decade or so, and is really nothing out of the ordinary. One person even said they simply continue to go about their daily business, unaffected by the political maneuverings outside. As events continue to develop, I'll be sure to share the updates via Facebook and Twitter. When it comes to marketing, brand image is everything. McDonald's has the golden arches, and no matter where you go in the world, when you see those two golden arches, you know it's McDonald's. And it doesn't matter if you're going there because you need a break today or if you're loving it. Companies spend a lot of time and effort on getting things just right, but sometimes they don't. I remember a classic mistake that Chevrolet made when they wanted to market the Chevy Nova in Latin America. They seem to forget that Nova means doesn't go, and as you'd expect, the car didn't sell well. So where am I going with all this? Well, in China, Burger King has a new drink on the menu that's called the Poo Poo Smoothie. Yeah, so what exactly is a Poo Poo Smoothie? Well, it's a mango fruit smoothie with small pearls of flavor, similar to what you would find in bubble tea. The approved English name is Mango Smoothie with Juicy Bubble, but apparently the creative marketing team decided to go with an interpretation of the sound one makes when enjoying the smoothie. Needless to say, it was a bad call, and the Poo Poo Smoothie has subsequently been removed from digital menus after a complaint. Now, many of us who live in Asia always say that when a company wishes to use English, they should have the copy reviewed by a native speaker to avoid errors such as this. The same advice should be followed by English brands when they want to move into foreign markets. This fiasco wasn't the first, nor will it be the last. But what strange and interesting ads have you seen over the years? Please be sure to share the names or the pictures in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Believe it or not, that's it for this week's episode. And before I go, I just want to stop and say thank you so much for spending part of your day, part of your week with me as we go over the big stories from the Asia-Pacific region. Now, I need to ask a little favor of you. If you know of someone who's interested in Asia or what's happening here, I hope you'll share Asia News Weekly with them. Now, you can always listen to the podcast on asianewsweekly.net, where we have a minute-by-minute rundown of all the different stories that are in each episode. But the show's also available on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. And if you use either of those two services, I hope you'll take a quick second to rate the show. I'm also always open to your feedback, so if you like something about the show, or if you don't, please put it in the comment section, write it on Facebook, tweet it to me. But if you want to share your thoughts privately with me, you can do that as well. Just fire up your email client and send me a message at podcast@asianewsweekly.net. Again, thank you so much for spending part of your day, part of your week with me, and until next time, remember to stay true to yourself, and as always, be awesome. Asia News Weekly is written and produced by Steve Miller and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.